for the annual Country Study Program. This year, it's the Year of Cuba. We've been having all kinds of incredible programming all year long. Coming up, we have a conference on March 20th and 21st with an amazing concert at the end by Brenda Navarrete. She's an Afro-Cuban jazz artist who's really very well known, especially in Cuba. So she'll be here on our campus performing. And at the very end of the semester, our last event of the year will be a two-night performance by Teatro Avante, a theater group out of Miami that's also an award-winning group. So there's some great upcoming events for the Year of Cuba. Today's program brings together two of my favorite people. We work together often with the Year of programs, and many of you are probably in their classes and have probably even participated in some of the in developing this exhibit. So Professor Dibble came to Kennesaw in 1996. She beat me by a year, so we've known each other a long time. And she teaches printmaking, especially. That's her area of expertise, and she's got her own print shop, Azilia Art House. You know, I don't think I've been there. I see.
Yeah, you're welcome to come though.
I need to do that over all these years. And then Professor Stevenson, who has been working as a curator as well as a professor, and she's curated some amazing exhibits at the Smithsonian, at the Carlos Museum, and is just about to publish a book. When does the book come out?
I wouldn't say just about to, but
a little bit.
It'll be a moment, but we're getting there.
Pretty soon. It's called Looking Both Ways: Carved Ivory Sculptures and Colonial Photography in the Congo. So that's going to be a really cool thing. I can't wait to see it. So I'll turn the floor over to Professor Dibble and Professor
Thank you.
Stevenson.
Thank you so much, Professor Paraka. Hi, everyone. It's great to see you. So we're going to keep this really informal, and we'll probably be kind of tag teaming back and forth. So what we hope to do is share with you a collaborative project that we were very fortunate to get support from by the Year of Cuba committee. So this is an official grant project that was supported. It was made possible through generous funding by KSU. And originally, the project was going to be seated in Cuba. That was the plan. We were working on a study abroad program to Cuba, and we came so close. We were one student short. It was exquisitely painful. So we did not get to go to Cuba, and in fact, the idea was to Professor Dibble works with a printmaking studio in Havana. We were going to start the project there and then bring it back to Atlanta and continue to work on it in the fall and the spring and then realize these exhibitions. So that didn't happen, but we used the summer instead to sort of incubate the project here in Atlanta. We worked with a couple of students. Sarah, is Sarah here? Oh my gosh, okay, Sarah and Julie, and they were great, and that was a really good thing to do because we could get feedback from the students, we could workshop things, we could see what worked, what didn't, and then Dr. Dibble really launched in the fall, and the students in Professor Dibble's class and Geo Sip's illustration class did extraordinary work. So what we're going to do is we want to just share this process with you, a little bit of the history of how this project came about, and then we're going to head over to the Fine Arts Gallery and see the work. And it's an extraordinary show. We had the opening last Tuesday, and I won't quote the professors, but one professor said to me he thinks this is the best KSU student art show he's seen to date. And it's really, really amazing work. So I know a lot of you were involved in this project. Thank you so much. So I want to just kick off with really the end point where we ended up, which is, I'm showing you here, this is the wall text This is a collaborative project between printmaking students, illustration students, and art history students. Many of you are here today, and so this is actually the introductory wall text to the show that the art history students in this class that meets at this time workshopped and came up with. And the goal of the project from the very beginning was to think about ways that we could engage students in researching the resilient cultural and religious traditions that survived the Middle Passage and that came from West Africa, that came from many communities in West Africa. And I decided to focus mostly on traditions that survived in Cuba and really thrived in Cuba that come from Nigeria, from various Yoruba kingdoms and communities that take the form of Orisha. So we wrote this text to really recognize that it was many different West Africans who came to Cuba, and that we're highlighting and focusing on just one of a plethora of religious conventions that traveled to Cuba, namely Orisha. Many Orisha then are syncretized with Catholic saints to form what's known as Santeria within Cuba. But what we wanted to do is be very respectful of the fact that Orisha are deities, and that we were engaged in a research project in creating art, and that we need to be really respectful of religious traditions. So we shifted the emphasis to looking at Orisha from the point of view of folklore, because there's a vast corpus of literature and storytelling around the Orisha. And from there sort of emerged the idea of, well, let's sort of think about them through the lens of the superhero. And Professor Dibble, who has been to Cuba, had in fact worked with a printmaking studio where Cuban artists had just produced a whole portfolio on the theme of the superhero. So it seemed like a really, really good fit. So if we look at what the superhero, here's the Oxford English Dictionary's definition of what a superhero is. So a superhero is a character associated with storytelling who typically has special powers, extra human abilities that they use generally for the purposes of good to help communities. And as we'll see, that idea sort of resonates with the notion of the Orisha if we look at them through a more secular lens in terms of sort of storytelling and oral history and folklore. So obviously when we think superheroes, we think comics, right? So we want to look at what are some of the maybe superhero traditions and comic traditions in Cuba. Are there Cuban superheroes? Well, there are Cuban superheroes, except for the ones that we're looking at here are not produced in Cuba. On the left, we're looking at Captain Britain's Great Flag Mystery, and you can see that there is a Captain Cuba. He's the guy in the middle on the left with really, really spectacular muscles. So this is a Marvel Comics edition that was brought out. It was actually a crossword puzzle. It was really designed for more educational purposes to help kids learn their geography, figure out, the different countries of the world. Turns out Marvel also created La Bandera, who is a female superhero, and it said that she originated from Cuba. Her superpower was that she had the ability to control people's emotions. That could really come in handy. So yes, there are Cuban superheroes that were developed outside of Cuba, but what about what's happening in Cuba? Well, there's a very strong graphic arts tradition in Cuba that goes back to the 19th century. Comic books emerged and were produced by local presses in Cuba in the 20th century. And no surprise, in the run-up to the revolution, comic books were strategically used. So here we're looking at Mela, which is an edition and a very well-known press that ran for about a decade that produced anti-Batista comic books. So comic books kind of serving as a vehicle for propaganda. And then in 1959, Castro, when he comes to power, he very much recognizes the potential for the comic book to be used strategically. And so we see that a number of comic books are developed. So here we have one, Revolution Cuban, where you see on the cover, there's a picture of Fidel Castro. He is like the quintessential Cuban superhero. But some of the fun things that happen, so for instance, we see under the Castro regime that American superheroes are kind of turned into anti-heroes. They're turned into the enemy of the Cuban government. So here we have a comic, Cuban-made comic, in which we see Superman and a bunch of his other pals coming in to attack Cuba, and then at the bottom there's this character, Poncho, who's this cute little dog, and he appears, inserts himself into the scene with a giant pair of scissors and cuts up the page, and therefore destroys Superman and his American capitalist henchmen. So one of the things I was curious about is, was there a tradition of Afro-Cuban folklore and characters working their way into Cuban comics? And I really couldn't find much. There are comics where history is engaged with, but generally it's Taino characters that come into play. There really wasn't any evidence for Afro-Cuban characters, Santeria or Orisha-based characters at all, which is really not surprising. But there are some examples where artists, so here we're looking at the work of Hugo Canto. He's a Brazilian artist, and he did this really fun series, his Orisha series. So here Orisha is spelt the way it is in Brazil. And so he highlighted the different Orisha, Shango, Yamaya, Oshun, and he actually published this series on Jack Kirby's 99th birthday to sort of honor him. So the way this project started is we wanted this to be an artist-scholar project. We wanted our students to be really engaging with research and to be taking the time to explore the material, and then from there to develop a character and storyboard that character. So the project started with me just coming in and sharing some really, really basic information with students. I privileged and focused on Yoruba Ifa traditions in Nigeria over Cuban ones. And so we started off by looking at who are Orisha? What do we mean by Orisha? So Orisha refer to deities. This is a map, kind of a diagram of how Yoruba communities in Nigeria would conceive of their worldview. And as you can see, it's conceived as existing as an other world, which is a sacred realm. And within the other world, there are a number of different beings. There is the creator god, and below the creator god, there are spirits, there are ancestors, and then there are the Orisha, right? And then there's various levels of communication between the other realm and the world of the living. So we focused exclusively on the Orisha, and you'll notice that the Orisha are divided into three groups. You can think of these almost as Orishas having different kinds of personalities, just like people, right? So there are Orisha such as Shango or Oya, who are considered to be hot, feisty. There are Orisha such as Obatala, who would be considered cool, right? And then there are temperate Orisha, those who sort of mediate and exist in between. So this became a really great place to start thinking about personalities, how students might explore the personality of an Orisha and kind of storyboard that into a superhero character. We spend a lot of time looking at Yoruba objects associated with the veneration of Orisha, and students noted that the works are very figure focused. They really emphasize the human figure. So here we're looking at a beautiful wooden carved altar to Shango. And if you look at the color of the work, you see that it's predominantly a warm color. It's like a rich ochre or red color. So this became a place where we could talk about color symbolism, right? So warm colors are typically associated with hot Orisha and indicate their hot persona. So Shango is male. He's a male Orisha. But we see here that the imagery is predominantly female in the images of children. And this is an image of a woman. She's kneeling, and she's actually holding Shango on her head. And Shango is contained within the container, right? So typically, Orisha are not represented in figurative form, right? They reside, their essence, their potency, their ashe, resides within containers. So that was kind of interesting, like what's revealed and what's hidden, right? So here's an image of followers of Obatala, and we would know that they were followers of a cool god because they are wearing a cool color, right? Whereas Orisha who are more temperate, we often see, for instance, Irinle, hunting, healing. So green is a color associated with Irinle. You're mixing cool and warm colors, yellow, primaries, yellow and blue to form green. So color symbolism was something that students really thought about a lot. We also explored the very intimate relationship between Orisha and their followers. And this is something that's forged through divination, that's forged through initiation into the following of an Orisha, and how you become a vessel as a follower of an Orisha for that Orisha. And so here we have an image of a woman. She's a follower, a devotee of Shango. She's carrying a staff that represents Shango. She's wearing red to signify the Shango, and she has become Shango. She is embodying Shango in this performance. So this all comes down to talking about, superheroes have power, right? So if we want to think about Orisha and superheroes, then we need to think about power. What is the power of the Orisha? And so this takes us to the concept of ashe. Ashe can be translated in a number of different ways, from Yoruba as power or authority or vital force. And ashe is life, it's life energy, it's the life force, and it exists in all things. It's conferred by the Creator God. Even though it exists in all things, some things have more ashe than others, right? So no surprise, Orisha are imbued with considerable ashe, right? And ashe is the power to make things happen, to transform things, to bring change about. So that became another really interesting kind of conversation around the notion of the superhero and their powers and Orisha. Where, if you are a person, where is your ashe housed? It is housed in what is known as your Ori. Ori is, in fact, an Orisha. Ori is said to be the sort of the lead Orisha of all of the Orisha. So there are, sometimes it's said there are 401 Orisha, sometimes it's said there are 2,000 Orisha, right? There are a lot of Orisha. And Ori represents the concept of head and destiny. And when initiates go through initiation, as these young children are here, their heads are marked as the place to denote their Ori, the house of their ashe, and their connection with the Orisha. And so here we have an image of two children in Nigeria, and a mother and her child during an initiation ceremony. And here we can jump across the ocean to Cuba to 1940. And here we have a young man who's going through initiation, and you'll see that even though there might be hundreds of years separating those two communities, although of course the travel and flow between Nigeria and Cuba did not end at the end of the slave trade, that he equally, his head is marked during initiation. We looked a little bit at Santeria traditions and the sort of the strong pull through from Nigerian Ifa. So here we're looking at an altar to Oshun in someone's home, and we see that again. It's basically a container, layered containers and assemblages of objects that have been accumulated and offered to Oshun, rather than a figurative image. And here's another image of another altar to a number of deities, and you'll see at the top are images of saints, and at the bottom are soperos housing the Orisha. So they come together, but they're also kept separate in this particular instance, which is kind of interesting. So that was kind of the historical background information that was shared with students. And we sort of pulled apart the most, we went into a lot more detail, but students really identified the color symbolism, the sort of triad of personalities, the importance of the head, the idea of inner and outer. What were some of the other important concepts that we pulled out? Containers. Valerie, can you think of anything else that we pulled out as a core idea to play with?
Well, there's color, gender, the powers, the just different things that kind of had everybody try and look through the Orisha and find one that they identified with. You know, because and there's all kinds of things like numbers, symbols.
Right, numbers were another element that
Yeah.
students got invested in.
Yes, there's quite a bit. Very
Yeah.
interesting study.
Anyway, at that point, I just walked away. So I did 1% of the work. And at that point, Dr. Dibble and Professor Sipp took over and worked with their students. And so I'm going to turn it over to Professor Dibble now, who's going to share with you the journey from then to now.
Well, then your class did this semester, all the labels and researching, so the 1% grew to quite a bit more. It was more than 1% anyway.
There you go. It's on. Thank you.
She's sweet enough to do this, but you know what I think I'm going to do is, can I just escape this for a second? Maybe, yeah. As Dr. Stevenson was saying, this was a 2-year project, or a 2-semester project, so we started in the summer, last summer, through the fall, through this spring, and then now, after the exhibit comes down, we're going to continue on with other things with this, because we like to disseminate, projects and just keep them long-term. As Dr. Paraka said, I've been here since 1996, and one of the things I really enjoy doing, and I feel like is a priority for learning, is finding something that we can research about the world around us and really have an in-depth experience that goes beyond the classroom. I have this I want to show you. This is from last semester. Hopefully it'll. Why won't this show up?
Do you want to launch the presentation?
Yeah. No, I didn't want to do that.
Oh, you didn't?
No, I just want the one slide.
You want to go forward?
Normally I go right here. Maybe it did it this time. I'm sorry. Anyway, I just want to show you what we did last semester. Hopefully I've got volume control here. It might buffer for a minute. So it was 2-part Dr. Stevenson and I worked in the summer, then Geo Sips class and I worked in the fall. And we decided to do one that was more on really modern illustrated superheroes. And we had this, so we had the criteria. We always have a prompt. In this particular case, we wanted, oops, let's see if we can get a little music maybe. We had everybody was assigned an Orisha and researched Orisha, did it 20 by 24. We did it movie posters. And then we put this up at Kennesaw Marietta. So the exhibit was quite a bit different than the one you're going to see today. So it had a different kind of prompt and a different motivation. But they were still researching the Orisha. So a lot of these students went from this project to this next one, so they got to broaden their research experience and move into a little bit of a different venue for sure. So let's see if I can do it again. So then we come into the beginning of spring 2020. We have a whole new idea of what we want to do. We have to really continue with the educational goals that we presented to the Year of Cuba to get a grant. We got some money that we could afford to do some interesting things. So anytime if you go forward in life, you're going to need to apply for things. You know, you want to have your goals, and we made them very, very specific. We wanted it to be interdisciplinary for sure, very reflective in our practices. A huge thing I love doing is fostering collaboration. I love to collaborate with other people. In this case, we were collaborating with the illustrators, the art historians, and the printmakers. Have kind of a rich, deep experience where they understand the museum, the need for the didactics and the imagery and that kind of thing. And just a rigorous reflection process, which we'll continue doing after this semester, and try and promote it out to a large audience base. Part of the goals include certainly process. We have research, production, dissemination, reflection. The research was a really interesting, rich experience for the students. I don't think any of them really knew a lot about the Cuban culture, a lot about the Orishas. Some of them we had to talk about production because the illustrators weren't printmakers weren't illustrators, so there's a lot of interaction there. We look forward to dissemination. We look forward to the reflective period, so we'll have that coming up here soon, where we really look over our experience and all discuss, you know, how it went and what we could do differently and that kind of thing. It really started, as Dr. Stevenson was saying, in 2016 I took a group of students to Cuba, and we did printmaking for the 2 weeks. We worked with the Taller Experimental Grafica. It was a wonderful printmaking studio. It was so interesting to be in the culture as a person, you know, who's in their 7th decade of life. I never dreamed I could go to Cuba. It had been quite closed off. So that was very interesting to actually get to go. The political climate was perfect at the time. We were really starting to have a lot of interaction that had never happened. So that was delightful. You can see how beautiful the studio is. And I tell you, if you ever want to override any prejudices you have in life, you really need to do a study abroad program and get out and travel, get out and see other worlds. These people have nothing, and they do so much with it. It's just amazing. So the students and I went there. The building was beautiful, large, no air conditioning, so it was quite hot. They had very antiquated printmaking equipment and things, but they did a lot with it. And one of the things Dr. Stevenson was mentioning that they did, they were having some freedom. So they were, for the first time, allowed to have an exhibit on superheroes. So they just felt like this was an amazing subject that they'd never been able to do before, and they were just having a wonderful time. We were there for the opening of the exhibit, and a couple weeks before us, the Obamas had gone through that studio and bought a couple prints, and the people were quite energized and excited about it. And it kind of was one of those things, our students were could not believe the restriction in freedom of speech and freedom of art. So it was really kind of eye-opening for all of us. So we worked with the guy in the center, who's one of the master printers at the Taller, and it was a delightful fellow. We had a wonderful, very rich, meaningful experience. So we come back here. Dr. Stevenson started us off in the summer trying to figure out the research possibilities, giving us prompts and different goals. And then I had to take over with the students. So you have Orishas, we have a format, we have a size, we have a process. How do we get these things? So we did just a variety of very common artist activities, one of which was certainly getting resource material. We posed for each other. We hired models. I told the students, I said, what do you want your Orisha to do? And we had a couple males, a couple females, some fluidity there. And just how do you want them posed? So they posed them this way, this way. So they had kind of opportunities to get source material. You'll see some of it, the exhibit, you'll see what people have used and how they did actually use this. So they got their own material. I have mine that I got, which actually is one of the students. She was standing up, of course, but I turned her over. And when you see my piece, you'll see how that worked out. And then I mirrored her and did different things. A student here that's in class here today, Virginia, she kind of knew what she wanted. She had Danny pose, and we lit him a certain way. We had lights, and we had ladders, and we had all this stuff, so we could, kind of get something that we could reference. And she ended up putting him in her print this way. And actually, this is a fine art print that she scanned in to make a digital image, put the model in there, put the globe, and it really reflects the spirit of the Orisha that she had researched. To expand on that, and really, I don't know how many artists I'm talking to in here, but I really encourage my students to think in a series and have one idea inspire the next idea, inspire the next idea, and just push, 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 and just keep these ideas expanding. And I really find like if you have artist block or something, it's a good way to get the flow going and works out well. So this student also took the Orisha into her vessel and did a weaving, which is from another class in textiles. So you can see here how that's just expanded. And then in the show, you'll see that there's also a piece from the jewelry class that we see here around Danny, oops, not this one, I'm sorry, Danny's neck. He's wearing the piece of jewelry that she made in small metals. So, I thought it was quite interesting, very, well-researched and pushed imagery. A lot of us did vessels. I did one for mine. I had chosen Yemiya, and she's like the queenly mermaid, the ocean mother goddess, the fierce, gentle life force. And I see myself as that kind of individual in contemporary society. So what she did mirrored what I felt like I do. So I picked different things, like we do handmade paper. So the little seaweed is handmade paper. Her followers throw coins in with the water towards her, so I use those. I'm from the beach area, Virginia Beach. I have all the shell collection. She collects cowrie shells, are one of the elements of her, so I used all those things. I also did a experiment with fabric dyeing. I immersed copper pennies, which I had used in the imagery anyway, because you know how when you are at a wishing well and you make a wish, you throw a coin in. You immerse them in a solution of 1/3 cup ammonia to 2/3 of a cup of water, and it leaches the blue dye out of there. There's some kind of mathematical formula or chemistry that happens, and I probably could quote it. I got the dye water. It took about a week or two for the copper to leach it out. I dyed some fabric. I used it as part of, I made a quilt, but I didn't use it at all the quilt. But it kind of makes this really great STEAM project. How many of you all know what STEAM is? Science, technology, education, art, and math. If you ever hear STEM, correct them. It's not STEM, it's STEAM. You have to have the art in there. And you can put that on the video. But it makes this, like you talk about collaborations or breadth and depth of your research and your study. They become very exciting when you can include other studies into it. So it becomes an experiment. If you add ammonia to copper, it creates a salt. It forms this deep blue color that's a precipitate that comes off the copper, and you can dye cloth with it. If I were to present this, I would go over to the chemistry department. I'd make them help me understand why it happens. In my world, I just know it does, and I enjoy it, and I play with it. The same holds true. I do I like to include things that I call women's work, quilting, embroidery, whatever, china painting and that kind of thing. So I love quilting, I love sewing. So and here too, I think I can make a STEAM project out of it because you have to measure, you have to cut. I created little wave patterns for my quilt. Out of some of it's out of the dyed cloth, most of it's store-bought. But then I used a cyanotype process to create my arisha. You saw my model before. So I only had 8.5 by 8.5 fabric. I had coated with a cyanotype chemistry. I could have gotten more, whatever, I was on a time constraint, so I just planned it out for the design to be 16 inches. So I had four 8-inch squares with selvage so I could sew them together. So, so I made negatives that were that size, 8 by 8 of the 4 pieces. Then I sewed them together. But the point I really wanted to discuss was the use of the cyanotype chemistry. Can anybody hear the word blue, the cyan in cyanotype? It's a blueprinting process. It's a photographic printmaking process, very historical, very old, one of the first alternative processes. When you do a cyanotype, you mix all this chemistry, ferric ammonium cyanide, potassium, something else, and it creates a blue color. You can coat it on paper, you can coat it on cloth, you let it dry, you expose it to the sun with either a negative or you can use plant material. Back in the 1800s, botanists would use it they'd go out and find a plant and put it on their cyanotype and expose it to the sun. You rinse it out with water and voila, there you are. What I really love about this process is, in fact, I've given presentations in Greece and other places about cyanotypes because it, once again, includes steam. And you can change the colors of this by adding things like tannic acid. Does anybody know where you get tannic acid? From like tea or from red wine. You can use common household materials. You can change the color from purple to blue. You can bleach it. You can do a lot of things. And the lovely part about it is you can do it right out of your kitchen. So you don't need a press or you don't need a photo studio. So I have always loved this one. Over my career, I think I mentioned I've done many projects. I call them social awareness. Last week I gave a talk at Social Justice about art and social justice, but really I see it as social awareness. So the Cuba project really intrigued me because a lot of the students don't know about Cuba. They have, so it was just a wonderful kind of thing you could weave in. The whole Yemia and me identifying with strong, powerful women. We did a project called What on Earth, and I created myself, my print was, or my block was, I was Mother Earth. So, I really do respond to that kind of imagery. We did this at NCUR, National Conference of Undergraduate Research, last spring. All the students researched things about Mother Earth. Made 2x4 foot blocks, and we printed them with a steamroller. It was quite lovely. So I'm really drawn to the strong female archetypes because I feel like I am one. In fact, if you go to valeriedibble.com, I have a picture of myself after we went to Italy. I found out they didn't have a patron saint of printmaking, so I made myself the patron saint of printmaking. Anyway, there was a funny story about that, but I'll save it for another time. So my goal for my piece, and I can only speak for my piece, some of the students when we get to the gallery, hopefully we'll talk about their pieces, was to depict Yemia, and certainly to do it using printmaking, using women's arts, the quilting. I incorporated things like the little pennies I stitched in. I don't know if you can see them here. I drilled holes in them, which I think is probably illegal, but and stitched them in because, like I said, the followers threw the coins in the water. She's all about water. The colors are like turquoise, blue, and white, cowrie shells, peacock feathers, watermelon. There's a lot of things that are part of her symbols, and I couldn't include them all. But I did want it to have some depth and detail. And then when we go to the gallery, you'll see a lot of the students chose to do vessels. This exhibit was much different than the first one because the first one being posters. We had kind of a strict format and more of a look about it that we wanted. With this one, I gave people free rein, and we also have a huge variety of process here. So you'll see lithographs that look different than the woodcuts, that look different than the prints on cloth, that look different than the vessel. So I think it's pretty interesting to see how everybody depicted their Orisha, and I kind of liken it to, I don't know, I love people's personal vision. I know one of the students in the class, Ashley did Yemiya, I did Yemiya, somebody else could have done it. So that was kind of exciting to see how people translate it their way. So I hope when we go down the hall, if you have questions and any kind of inquiries about things, you really share them with us, because there's a lot of rich detail here that you can't see, or I can't anticipate what you'd be interested in. When you look at some of the vessels, I know Jimmy did a really interesting one that was glass and has this light, kind of thunderous light inside. You saw Virginia's with the weaving. Somebody carved on gourds, and they all relate to some kind of research that involves their Orisha. So with that said, if you don't have any, we won't take questions here. We'll just walk down the gallery.
Yeah.
Okay.